In this tutorial, we are going to take your website from simple to stylish. We'll learn the basics of CSS, explore selectors, and see how you can use them to make your website look cleaner, more attractive, and professional. First, let's create our basic HTML structure. We'll start with the doctype HTML declaration, followed by the HTML head and body elements. Inside the body, we'll add an H1 heading with the text internal style sheet. This will give us a simple element that we can style with CSS. Next, inside the head, we'll add the style tag. This is where our CSS will go. Since the CSS is written directly inside the HTML file, this is known as an internal style sheet. Inside the style tag, we'll use the P selector to target our paragraph. Then we'll add the font family property and set it to Arial. So when we write font family, Arial, we are telling the browser to display the paragraph text using the Arial font. This is a simple example of how CSS can change the appearance of our HTML elements. You can experiment with different font families later, but for this example, we'll keep it simple and use Arial. Once you save and refresh the page, you'll be able to see the paragraph displayed in the new font. Now let's remove the style tag from the head because we are going to try a different way of styling our HTML. Instead of writing the CSS separately inside the head, we'll add the style attribute directly to our H1 element. This allows us to apply CSS directly to that specific heading. For example, we can add font family, courier, to the H1 and see how the font changes instantly. This method is called Inline CSS because the styling is written directly inside the HTML element. It's a quick and simple way to apply a style to one specific element, and it's useful when you only want to make a small change without affecting other elements on the page. However, keep in mind that as your website gets larger, writing styles directly on every element can become difficult to manage. Later, we'll look at better ways to organize your CSS and style multiple elements efficiently. Now, open up your browser and refresh the page so we can see the update. You should notice that the heading has changed to the new font we just applied. This is a great way to see how even a small change in our CSS can immediately affect the appearance of our web page. As we continue, we'll make more styling changes and see the results directly in the browser. The third and most commonly used method is an external style sheet. Instead of writing our CSS directly inside the HTML file, we create a separate CSS file, such as styles CSS, where we keep all of our styling rules. Then, inside the head of our HTML document, we use the link element to connect the CSS file to our web page. This keeps our HTML and CSS separate, making the code cleaner, easier to read, and much easier to manage. The biggest advantage is that the same CSS file can be linked to multiple HTML pages. So if you make a change to your website's design, you only need to update the CSS file, and the changes can be applied across all the pages using it. Now, in the head, we'll link our external CSS file using the link element. The ref equals style CSS tells the browser exactly which CSS file to load and apply to our HTML page. Next, open the Style CSS tab, and let's add our first CSS rule. We'll use the body selector and set the font family to Cambria. This means the browser will apply the Cambria font to the content inside the entire body. So instead of styling each element individually, we can set a font for the whole page with just one simple rule. Save the CSS file, open your HTML page in the browser, and refresh it. You should now see the text on the page change to the Cambria font. This shows how an external style sheet allows us to control the appearance of our web page from a separate CSS file. Now let's learn the basic CSS syntax and the different types of selectors we can use. We'll start with an element selector such as body, display style, H1. The selector tells the browser which HTML element we want to style, while the curly braces contain the styling rules. Next, we can use a class selector with a dot, like dot. Card. This allows us to style multiple HTML elements that have the same class name. Finally, you have the ID selector, which uses a hash symbol, like hashtag header. An ID is used to target a specific element with that unique ID. Now let's add some styling to the body and make our web page look a little more interesting. We'll start by adding a background color and set it to Alice Blue. This will give the entire page a soft light blue background, making it easier on the eyes and giving our website a cleaner appearance. Next, we'll set the font family to Arial. Since we're applying these styles to the body, the font will be inherited by most of the text throughout our web page. We'll also set the font style to Italic. This means we don't have to set the font separately for every paragraph or heading. So, our body selector will now control two important aspects of the page: the overall background color and the default font. Save the CSS file, open or refresh the page in your browser, and you should immediately see the light blue background, along with the Arial font applied to the content. This is a simple example of how CSS properties work together to change the overall look and feel of a web page. Now let's take a closer look at what we write inside the curly braces. The code inside these braces is made up of property and value pairs. A property describes what we want to change, while the value tells the browser how we want to change it. The property and value are separated by a colon, and each declaration ends with a semicolon. For example, font family, Arial, means the property is font family, while Arial is the value. We can also have multiple declarations inside the same set of curly braces, such as background color, Alice Blue, and font family, Arial. Each declaration should end with a semicolon, so the browser can clearly understand where one style ends and the next one begins. So, if we put everything together, the full CSS syntax follows a simple pattern: selector, property, value, property, value. The selector tells the browser which HTML element we want to target, and inside the curly braces, we add one or more property and value pairs to define how that element should look. For example, we might use the body selector followed by properties such as background color and font family. Each property is followed by a colon, then its value, and each declaration ends with a semicolon. This pattern is the foundation of CSS. Once you understand the relationship between the selector, properties, and values, you can start creating more advanced styles and control almost every visual aspect of your web page. To write a comment in CSS, we use at the beginning and at the end. Anything written between these symbols is treated as a comment, so the browser will ignore it and it won't affect the styling of the web page. Comments are useful for adding notes or explanations to your CSS code, especially when your style sheet becomes longer and more complex. For example, you could write a comment to explain what a particular section of styles is doing. You can also use comments to temporarily disable a CSS rule without deleting it. This can be very helpful when testing different styles or troubleshooting your code. To group multiple selectors together in CSS, we can write each selector separated by a comma. For example, we can write selector 1, selector 2, selector 3, and then place our property and value pairs inside the curly braces. This is a very useful technique because it allows us to apply the exact same styles to multiple HTML elements without having to write the same CSS code over and over again. Now let's go back to our index.html file and add an H2 and an H3 to the page along with our existing H1. This gives us 3 different heading levels that we can style together. Once we've added those headings, let's go back to our style CSS file and create a group selector using H1, H2, H3. Inside the curly braces, we'll add color, navy, and font family, Arial. The color property will change the text color of all 3 headings to navy, while the font family property will change their font to Arial. Because we group the selectors together, these 2 styles will automatically be applied to the H1, H2, and H3 elements. An alternative way to achieve the same result would be to write 3 separate CSS rules for each heading. For example, we could write H1, H2, and H3, and then add the same properties and values inside each set of curly braces. This approach works perfectly fine, but as you can see, it requires us to repeat the same CSS code multiple times. If we wanted all 3 headings to have a navy color and an Arial font, we would need to write color, navy, and font family, Arial, 3 separate times. However, if the styles are exactly the same, grouping the selectors with commas is usually a cleaner and more efficient approach. Instead of repeating the rules, we can simply write H1, H2, H3, display_style h3, and apply the styles once. Both methods will produce the same result, but grouping selectors helps keep our style sheet shorter and easier to maintain. You can also group different types of selectors together, such as element selectors, class selectors, and ID selectors. As long as you separate each selector with a comma, you can apply the same styles to all of them. This gives you even more flexibility when organizing and styling your web page. And that brings us to the end of this video. Today, we learned the basics of CSS, including CSS syntax, selectors, properties, and values, comments, grouping selectors, and the different ways we can add CSS to an HTML document. We also saw how these techniques can help us keep our code clean, organized, and easier to manage. In the next video, we'll continue building on these concepts and learn even more ways to style and improve our websites. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.